I was sort of curious to hear how you kind of came to these two filmmakers yourself, just through your own life, and also, and then subsequently the book, and sort of how, and maybe you can talk also just sort of you getting interested in movies in your life and sort of how these guys factor into that.
I got interested in movies through movie stars, and so my generation. I'm talking about, my father was in World War II, and I think that a lot of people of my generation, and this is a big part of what film culture is, I think, were attracted to cinema of an earlier era because it put them in touch with, first of all, it was on TV all the time. You would watch it with your parents, and then you had the experience of something connected with the way that they lived their lives and with the way that my grandparents lived their lives. And Bogart was really a big thing for me when I was young, and I was very, very attached to what, my father and the way that he moved and the way that he behaved. And I associated them. I didn't think of it in that way at the time. But then I started getting interested in them in different ways, in movies in different ways. And so there was this TV series that Richard Schickel did called The Men Who Made the Movies. It was like 1972, I think. It was on PBS. It was on every Sunday. And Cliff Robertson, who features prominently in your film about Brian De Palma, narrated it. And so one of the people was Hitchcock. And I don't think I had seen any Hitchcock movies at that point, but I was really, taken with him and with Hawks.
And how old were you then?
Like 12, 11, something like that. Yeah. And then the book I got right around that time. And what Fincher says is my experience. I had it and I just kept poring over it and kind of looking at, rereading different passages and looking at those photo montages. And seeing the actual layouts of them when I was in Paris researching this movie was great, because he did them all, by hand, and he realized he had to have done them from memory. Mm-hmm. So I do think that I've never even really made a practice, even now, of looking at them and, kind of comparing them to the images on the screen, but I do think that they're slightly inaccurate, but that doesn't matter.
Right, right. Yeah, I had the experience with the book.
How old were you when you got it?
Well, I guess I must have been around the same time looking at it, for the, I'd seen Hitchcock movies on television, but my parents had it, but it was the same thing of, like, I actually experienced some of the movies through the interviews before I saw the movies. I don't know if you had that. And what about Truffaut? When did you get interested or sort of come across him?
I lived in a town with a bunch of movie theaters, which was cool, because it was near. I grew up in Pittsfield, Massachusetts, and so that's in the Berkshires, and it's between Williamstown, a college town, and then down county is the fancy places, Lenox and Stockbridge. That's Norman Rockwell land, But there was a lot of, what do I want to call it, aesthetic hippie culture around, plus, the Leonard Bernstein connection, plus theater in Williamstown, where Jake's mom, was every summer, Blythe Danner. And so I think that Truffaut, there were movies actually, actual movies would play in theaters back in those days. That doesn't really happen as much anymore. Because there were no multiplexes. Those came later. And so Day for Night I saw, and I was really pretty taken with it. I don't remember what else, what order. But there was a thing at that time, when you were young too, there was the whole like Truffaut, Godard, Lennon, McCartney thing. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that still happens sometimes, doesn't it?
But probably less so now, I guess. And Antonioni, Fellini, right? That was another.
Antonioni, Fellini. Yeah, that's right.
There's like the smart choice, the right answer, and then the popular answer.
That's right. Yeah, that's right.
And as I've gotten older, I've basically just come around to the popular answer.
The popular answer, which is the right answer after all, right?
I guess so.
Were you there at the screening of Arnaud de Bachan's movie in the festival, My Golden Days, when he was talking about his Truffaut story? He models his screenwriting on Truffaut's screenwriting.
Oh no, I actually didn't see the Q&As, but I saw the movie.
Well, he said Truffaut was working on a screenplay with Jean Gruot, and he read something. He said, "No, you don't understand." He said, "I'm not Antonioni. I don't want one idea for every 4 minutes. I want 4 ideas for every 1 minute.
That's good.
Y tus trailers. Visita mi canal.
Something I was interested in, also having just made a documentary too, is what is the documentary for you? What does like the script look like? Like when you went into this for the first, when you started, like how much are you filming before you start shaping, or how much do you have how much did you know in advance, I suppose, going into it?
I wanted to. I listened to the tapes. There's 27 hours of them. I transcribed most of it myself, which was my way of listening to it. And then I identified the areas where I felt energy between the two of them. That's a vague thing to say in a way, but it's also, it describes very specifically the way that I felt. I wanted to find where there was an emotion between them, where there was some kind of a sense of something passing between the two of them. And then after I did the interviews with people, same thing. And so we kind of started from the middle out. In other words, that would be the dream thing. Was really the nucleus of the film, and then from there, obviously, what films, what's the direction of things? Well, it seems like the right thing to do to focus on Vertigo. And then for different reasons, not just because Vertigo is great, but because it stands for a lot of different things and cross currents, and then dreams flow into Vertigo, and then that kind of thing. I wanted to make a movie,
right? And in terms of your interviews with the contemporary directors, how much did they shape sort of your thinking about either about the directors or about the book, or did you? I was also curious if you asked them all the same questions.
I had areas that I focused on, and I asked them a lot of the same things. They're all people that I know. So I wanted to, so there were different things that I knew that they were going to focus on. I know that, Olivier is not the kind of guy who talks about a scene in detail. Arnaud is, and Marty is. Marty tends to go in many different directions, and, it's always very surprising. He always says, I don't have much time, and then he went, 2 hours later, you're wondering if there's still enough room left on the card. Fincher's kind of the same. I mean, he was just like, eventually Sion, his wife, came in and said, like, gotta go, but, I think that, again, it's like I listened to what people were saying, and then I thought about how it interacted with what was going on between the two of them, Hitchcock and Truffaut, and the images, and went from there.
Yeah, I was thinking, and I've actually had this conversation with other filmmakers that, and it's also with the De Palma movie that I made. I've been asked questions to this degree of. But I actually find that, I don't know if you found this, but the filmmakers often are kind of more interested in talking about filmmakers that are more unlike them.
Yes, they're interested in talking about anybody but themselves.
Right,
a lot of the time.
And also like maybe the more specific, like the more obvious influences. It's just interesting. Like a lot of these the contemporary directors are not. Hitchcockian wouldn't be the first thing necessarily you would say about them. I mean, maybe you would about certain areas of Fincher, but but clearly they're all very passionate about those movies.
There's only so much you can say about your own movie, right?
Right.
I mean, in other words, you have to sort of like at a certain point, you're just sort of like, I made the movie. I'm not going to talk it.
Well, you basically make something up that you say.
Yeah,
and
right.
then repeat it.
Like we're doing now, right?
Yeah.
Energy. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, the real answer
My
is...
approach to the story. Yeah,
I just needed to get this out of me.
Yeah. I mean, if you were to ask Hitchcock, like, tell us what, the ending of Vertigo when the nun comes out and then Jim Stewart goes out, talk about that. What the fuck would he say, honestly,
Right.
But it's interesting. But when people are talking about someone else's work, it gives them a way of focusing. And then when they're talking about filmmaking in relation to it, it adds another layer, as you know from, I mean, in the case of Brian, in your film, and you and I have talked about the two films a lot. They're complementary in a really interesting way. I mean, he's talking about filmmaking, but he is able to do it, with his own movies. But even he, when he's saying, well, I mean, when I shot the drill scene in Body Double, it's just like, I don't know, it just made sense to me, the way that you guys include that.
The drill had to go through the floor.
The drill had to go through the floor, I mean, that's all there is. Of course he was going to drill the woman through the stomach. He's not going to sit there and perform a psychoanalytic, exercise on himself.
Well, which is also what makes the book so kind of interesting, is that it is, because Truffaut is a critic but also a filmmaker, it really, that he finds a way to talk to Hitchcock that actually engages him and makes it about filmmaking and doesn't get into sort of, the stuff that he's not going to want to talk about.
Yeah. It's great when Hitchcock says, do you find it too much trouble to direct your actors?
Right.
And Truffaut's like, well, I have an intermediary formula. I like to take them out to dinner and talk to them and then incorporate some of their words into the dialogue. And Hitchcock's like, oh, you mean you have to write at night?
Yeah. I know. Well, I found actually very moving in the movie is that is related to that is him talking about his concern, which you see again later in the letter, of that he's been too trapped in on his path and the way he makes movies. Yeah. There's something, I mean, so confident, obviously, and so, I mean, it just seems like fully formed what is Hitchcockian, what is, what Hitchcock does in his movies, that to hear him kind of wonder if he should have tried it another way, is
it's very touching.
It's very touching and very interesting. I mean, because you see Hitchcock's influence in Truffaut in kind of very sort of straightforward ways. I'm sure there's a lot of nuanced ways as well. But I mean, even just Bride Wore Black or things where he's really kind of like taking it on. But Hitchcock doesn't have that move in his movies.
Yeah, I mean, it's touching that he was worried about that. I think it had to do with him thinking, well, would I have been taken more seriously as an artist? Would John McCartan at the New Yorker have treated me with more respect? Would Bosley Crowther have been, that kind of thing? And I because as Rick says in the movie, of course, he must have been entirely confident in all of his choices within his own framework, but his own framework is finally vast. I mean, that's the thing. It's not a teeny tiny circumscribed world. He's not like Antonioni, not to rag on Antonioni again, but I mean, he's not narrowing things down to a point in terms of what existence is about. And so his films, to me, just feel absolutely inexhaustible. I mean, I've just literally never seen a bad one. I mean, you can argue some are certainly not masterpieces, but that's not the question. The question is, and it has to do with his engagement with his art form, It's interesting because you also focus on Vertigo and Psycho sort of the most in terms of the movies. That he made both. I mean, in sort of two iconic movies, and one totally not accepted in its time, and the other changed everything in the moment. Hit the moment right on the head. And it's interesting to sort of think of it that way, that he, both. That he had both of those things happen, to be both misunderstood and totally popular at the same time is interesting about him. Yeah, it is, and it's also fascinating that the same year that Psycho was made, L'Avventura was made, right. And Antonioni did the same thing. Right. He made his star, his ostensible star, the heroine, disappear. And actually, that is something that we were dealing with in the movie, and then it just kind of sat there. It was just, Olivier talked about it, and it's just but it felt very academic. It didn't feel right for the energy of the movie, but what he did was something that just opened a door to, I don't even know what, forget about all the movies that were made in the wake of Psycho. It really changed the way that we thought about stories, I think.
We were talking about this before, but in terms of there's Hitchcock's influence on cinema, and then there's Hitchcock's influence on, say, specific filmmakers, and in the movie I made about Brian, Brian says he feels he's the only person who's actually continued in the Hitchcockian tradition, and I know what he means in a certain way, because he made his movies in some ways are kind of connected to the same, almost sort of, it's like, you said it better than I'm about to say it in the lobby, but it's like he's the idiosyncrasies of them. It's like he's more almost connected to the perversity of Hitchcock. Obviously he does sort of stylistic things and narrative things that are very connected to Hitchcock. But there was a time, we were talking about, in the '80s, there were all these movies, sort of final analysis, movies, and things that were all called Hitchcockian, but they're actually not nearly as odd as Hitchcock. They're very conventional, and in a way, it was the wrong. It was the wrong way to look at the influence in a way.
Yeah, but that's what Kiyoshi Kurosawa says in this movie, which I think is quite right. He's like, the book is like a Bible, but I'm very careful to never ever repeat anything. Right. Because it's the deceptive thing that happens, with Bresson's book about Notes on the Cinematographer. It's a great thing to read, but as a prescription for how to make movies,
I can't make heads or tails of it.
Okay. Yeah, it's proper to Bresson.
Right.
For him to say, well, this is the way you should all make movies. It's just okay.
Right.
But with Brian, he did something that nobody else has done, I think. He treated another filmmaker's work as a world and a practice in and of itself. That's kind of unprecedented, I think, and made his own, built his own world alongside it,
right. Yeah.
or out of it.
Yeah. Do you see Hitchcock's influence now in movies? Beyond the fact that it's just in the air?
I don't know. It's what you said. You don't. He's being so incorporated into film, making that you don't even know. It's like saying, where's D.W. Griffith's influence, actually? Because he didn't, he's not, he only started it a little bit later.
Right.
I guess that you mentioned Fincher. I didn't really, when I asked Fincher, I fully expected him to say, I don't really have much to say about Hitchcock. I don't really see a link between the two of them. I think that they're involved with very different kinds of enterprises, but I do think that they have different approaches to their art form. But I think that when I said, have you ever read that book? And so he said, just a couple hundred times, And and so I thought that was interesting. In the sense that and I guess I would say, whatever one can say about Gone Girl, when he's talking about Vertigo and he's saying, well, I think that the more honest story is her point of view. One can debate whether Gone Girl is an adequate vehicle for that, but there's something about it that does express the other side of that equation,
Do we have, does anybody want to ask a question from the audience? Right here.
That Jimmy Stewart had an erection. That's a revelation right there. I don't know. The thing is, it's not a conversation that's filled with revelations, I would say, in terms of, it's filled with a lot of insight into cinema and the practice of cinema. And I think that when he's talking about Rope, he goes into a lot of detail that's absolutely fascinating. I think that the tapes are extremely different from the book, because I think that what happened with the book was that Truffaut worked on it. It was translated into French. He really didn't understand English. Hitchcock did understand French. Truffaut did not understand English. And then I think that the book in English was retranslated back into English. And so Hitchcock was privately disappointed with that side of it. he never
Y tus
expressed that to
trailers.
Truffaut.
Visita mi
But
canal.
his humor and his spontaneity are not in the book. It's just, not a question. But I do think that also you get the feeling when you're listening to it that he didn't like to argue. Truffaut would bring up something that's a little bit, you would say, there's a big thing about The Wrong Man, as you know in the book, and Truffaut's laying down this whole anti-documentary thing, and, it's not your kind of material, and it would have been a better film if someone else had directed it, et cetera, et cetera. And he also lays on his anti-British number, the way that Godard does in his Histoire du Cinéma, too, Hitchcock's way of responding is interesting, because he actually just doesn't want to argue. He just kind of goes very quiet. In the book, you have the impression that he's just kind of agreeing with him, which isn't quite true. Yeah. So, other than that, the other revelations are like lunch. There's a lot of eating in the book and the tapes. Yeah.
Anybody over here?
Like I say, it's a different experience. The book is one of the great texts. It's just formative for anybody who's interested in movies. But the emotional weave between them, and also, it's like after having spent a lot of my life looking at Hitchcock's films and living with them and watching them with, my friends and my family, and re-experiencing them, and it's different in that sense. Like I say, I think his films are inexhaustible. Yeah. Okay. Bob Balaban was a very good friend of Truffaut's. They got to be very, very close when they were making Close Encounters of the Third Kind, and I think that Bob actually acted as Truffaut's. He actually did what his character is doing in the movie. He acted as Truffaut's translator. And so, and also, because I wanted to stay within the realm of filmmakers, Bob's made some pretty good movies himself. Parents is good. My Boyfriend's Back. He was great.
Great. Well, thanks a lot, Kent. And
Thanks for doing it, man.